Hi guys, welcome back to the Literature Life. This is part 5th of the 6 video lectures on Counter History and the Anecdote by Stephen Greenblatt and Catherine Gallagher. But before moving on, I'd like to take a moment to thank all you wonderful people for your support. I've already reached my first 100 subscribers and I thank each and every one of you for that. I promise the content is only going to get better from here, so thank you so much. And now let's get back to work. So, in the previous video, we talked about Sally Alexander, a woman historian in the 1970s who noticed two significant problems in the way history was written in her time. Number one, the mainstream historians did not question cultural system in their analysis. By not questioning cultural systems, they left those patriarchal structures undisturbed that were beneficial for the overall smooth functioning of the society but resulted in women's exploitation. For example, if the cultural practice of marrying a girl off at the age of 16 was convenient for the father and the rest of the family and the society, it was carried out in the name of culture and no one questioned it because supposedly culture was supposed to stay stable and was not to be questioned through historical analysis. And thus, women's exploitation continued in the name of a stable, undisturbed culture. This was the first problem that she encountered. The second problem that she noticed was that in the 1970s, when she asked for a separate women's history in the People's History Movement workshop, the men present in the workshop ridiculed her for even having such an idea. The People's History Movement in which Alexander raised this demand was itself a movement of the marginalized people. So Alexander noticed that a women's history had no place even within a marginalized history movement. So both these problems led Alexander to raise two questions that are significant for this lecture. The first question that she raised was, what can and cannot be included in the field of history? And who decides that? And how is it decided? In other words, how the boundaries of history are formed. What should be included and what should not be included? That was the first question. And number two, why is culture and cultural systems deliberately kept outside the field of historical inquiry? So you see that basically the last lecture ended on one ultimate question: why culture is not included in historical analysis. And here comes Raymond Williams, a novelist, a Marxist historian, and a noted literary theorist who based almost his entire academic career on proving the complexity of the concept of culture and in demonstrating how culture forms an important part of any society and therefore should not be excluded from historical analysis. He introduced the concept of cultural materialism to prove that even cultural factors are material, are significant, and make a difference to the way a society is formed and functions. Thus, by boldly including culture into the field of history, he created scope for a counter-history that was based on the cultural aspects of a society. And this is the reason why Greenblatt and other counter-historians were immensely inspired by Williams. But also because Greenblatt had a chance to be in Williams' company when he received his Fulbright scholarship to the University of Cambridge, where Williams was a professor. But basically, his contribution to the field of cultural studies is the reason why Williams enjoys this significant space in this important new historicist essay that we are reading. Alright, so without much delay, let's begin with the text. I'm reading from page number 60 of my text. Greenblatt writes, if one person can be said to have epitomized the renegade tendencies of the British culturalist left in those years, it was Raymond Williams. So Raymond Williams epitomized, he represented the renegade tendencies. What is renegade tendencies? The oppositional attitudes, the rebellious attitudes of the British culturalist left. The culturalist left historians were those historians who were focused on the study of culture and favored the left-wing politics. And for those of you who are not clear about what left-wing politics is, any politics that opposes the mainstream right-wing orthodox traditional ideas is called left-wing politics. So obviously, the left-wing culturalists included culture in their historical analysis and thus rebelled against the traditional mainstream historians. And Raymond Williams was an epitome, a supreme example, a champion of such rebellious attitudes of the culturalist left-wing history. Alright, Greenblatt continues. The various streams of what we've been calling counter-history met in his work. The various themes and issues that counter-historians raised and we studied in the previous lectures of this essay, Greenblatt says, they all meet in Williams' work. What are these themes and issues? Let's discuss. An attention to those forces resisting the processes of modernization. Williams, like a true counter-historian, paid attention to those few people, their narratives, and the aspects of their consciousness. Now, this is a differentiating aspect in Williams. He pays attention to the aspects of their consciousness as well that were the victims of the problems of modernization. Like the beginning of industrialization, urbanization, mechanization, coming of the railroads and newspapers brought with themselves a new form of control. For example, in his book, The Country and the City, Williams shows how ideological discourses like nationalism could only become successful because of the railways and the rise of the print media. In Williams's work, there's an attention to these forces that resisted this rapid modernization and the ideologies that came along with it. And please don't worry if you don't understand what this means, because these 4 points that are mentioned in the first paragraph are only the introduction. These points are the issues that we are going to discuss all through this section. So this will get clear to you if it is not right now. Alright, so this was the first stream of counter history present in Williams' work. The second stream of counter history that we find in Williams' work is the exploration of the cul-de-sacs where unrealized possibilities were stranded. What are cul-de-sacs? Cul-de-sacs are dead ends, those deserted, lonely, abandoned ends of roads where no one goes and nothing is to be found. As far as writing of history is concerned, especially Williams' writing, the cul-de-sacs mean those aspects of human experience and human consciousness that were considered too insignificant and too subjective, too personal to be included in the mainstream history by the orthodox Marxist historians. So Williams explored these cul-de-sacs. And how did he do it? By reading between the lines of literary texts. According to Greenblatt, some unrealized possibilities were lying there, were stuck there, they were stranded. And Williams went to those cul-de-sacs, lingered in those supposedly dead corners and rescued those unrealized possibilities, those new insights that were waiting to be disclosed, but no one really considered literature important enough to bring those unrealized possibilities out. So this is what he did, and this was the second stream of counter history present in Williams' work. The third one is a determination to chart the dynamic interaction between history's usual object of study, the myriad relations constituting society, and the culture normally assigned to anthropologists and literary critics. Now, this is a long sentence and sounds complicated, but the meaning is really simple. It means, in Williams' work, we find a strong desire to study and demonstrate the interaction between society and culture. For the traditional historians, society was a subject to be studied only by historians, and culture was a subject suitable only for anthropologists, people who study culture as their subject, and literary critics. In Williams' view, culture and society are not two separate, isolated subjects fit for different disciplines, but in his view, they negotiate with each other and impact each other. The society, a particular society, influences and forms its own culture, and the culture in turn forms the society and shapes and reshapes it. Williams studies this interaction between culture and society. The fourth stream of counter history present in Williams' work is, according to Greenblatt, and I'm reading from the text, an overriding interest in the making of such concepts as society and culture. In Williams' work, we find that he is strongly interested to find out what really forms concepts such as society and culture. For example, in his book Culture and Society, he showed how concepts such as society, culture, democracy, and civilization were not fixed concepts as the mainstream historians professed, but he showed how these concepts evolved in the response to the pressures of their age. In his work, Williams wanted to study this shift of meaning, this evolution, this change, and he wanted to challenge the mainstream historians' perception that these concepts were fixed, static, stable. Alright? So you can see that by focusing on marginalized narratives that resisted modernization, by exploring the cul-de-sacs where unrealized histories were waiting to be discovered, by showing that society and culture interact with each other and are not fixed concepts but constantly evolving processes, Williams met all the criteria of counter history that Greenblatt has mentioned earlier in this essay. Alright, Greenblatt continues. Because Williams' disciplinary hybridity gave him a much wider readership than that of the radical historians, especially in countries like ours, where the literature of Britain is more frequently studied than its history, he not only diffused the counter-historical mentality throughout literary and cultural studies, but also gave it a peculiarly literary spin. So this means that Williams' disciplinary hybridity, what is disciplinary hybridity? That since Williams was both a historian and a novelist and a literary critic, he was not fixed to one discipline and had expertise and authority in both history and fiction as well as literary criticism. And because of his hybrid expertise, he used one discipline to explore another. This causes the disciplinary hybridity. For example, in his novel, The People of the Black Mountains, he explored the history of the Welsh people. It was a historical novel, so he uses history for fiction. And in his book Culture and Society, he explored the historical evolution of English society and concepts through literary works, right from the age of Southey and Coleridge to the times of T.S. Eliot and George Orwell. So Greenblatt considers his disciplinary hybridity as the reason why Williams' work was so widely read in the United States, where people are more interested in reading British literature and literary criticism than British history. Since Williams had a wide readership, he had a great impact in showing his readers how counter history can be created if we use literature to approach history, and how we use history to illuminate, to add meaning to literary works. And thus you can see he enthused the counter-historical spirit throughout literary and cultural studies, and thus you can see he gave it a literary spin. Alright, Greenblatt further continues. One implication of Williams' work is that literature itself can be read as counter-history. But first, one would have to abandon or drastically modify the kind of ideology critique that had formed the standard fare of literary critics on the left. Now, before beginning to explain you the more complicated part which just starts, I should tell you that through this section, Greenblatt brings Williams' insights to show you how he was not a great fan of the ideology critique. What this means, I'll explain to you in a minute, but he did not like the ideology critique in its rigid form. And number two, the insights of Louis Althusser, who brought in the essay Ideology and the Ideological State Apparatuses, his way Williams considered to be too structural, too rigid. So throughout this essay, Greenblatt uses Williams's words and Williams's ideas to critique, to criticize the ideology critique and structuralism of Althusserian methods. If it sounds too complicated, don't worry, it will be clear as you read the essay. But before moving on, I need to explain two very important features of Marxist theory that will make this section understandable to you. And you've got to pay attention to these 2 points, because if you don't understand these 2 points, then the rest of the essay is going to be hazy. Alright? So the first one is, and listen carefully, most orthodox Marxists have a pretty strict notion of how a society works. Alright? They are very fixed on that. They think it's really clear, it's a formula that can be applied. They believe that any society functions on two levels. There's an economic base, they call it the base, which consists of the means of production like labor, land, capital, machinery, and production relations between the labor and the owners of production systems. According to the orthodox Marxists, this is the primary aspect of any society. And now comes the second point. On this primary foundation, on the base, rests a superstructure. This superstructure, according to these Marxists, is supposed to be a cluster of secondary systems like education, law, religion, and culture. Louis Althusser, a French philosopher, I just talked about him, and I'll say that again, that he advanced the idea that the forces of the superstructure that rests on the base, are these forces, the superstructural forces, are controlled by the economic factors of the base. The base controls the superstructure. The economic systems of the base control the cultural systems of the superstructure. So, for example, whatever was published as a literary work, which is a part of culture, was controlled by the people who had economic power. And thus, these people who were in power, they tagged those works as worthy literature that advanced their own interest, that was favorable to their image. For example, Stephen Greenblatt in his work Renaissance Self-Fashioning demonstrates how Queen Elizabeth, the queen who controlled all the economic resources of the nation, favored and encouraged plays that showed her in a positive light and was concerned about those plays that portrayed her as a controlling monarch. Most left-wing critics believed that this view considered literature to be a cultural epiphenomena of the economic phenomena. This considers culture as a secondary byproduct of the base, an ideological construct created by the people in power to keep the people of the society under an invisible control through literary texts and their characters. For example, they create a Ram and a Ravan, then tag Ram as the good person and Ravan as the bad person. And people will try to emulate Ram, follow Ram, and be like him. And they will be disgusted by all the Ravans in the society. This is how ideology controls a society, and literary texts are considered to be one of the tools to advance such ideologies. This is called the ideology critique, which most of the left-wing critics followed. Now, Williams doesn't disagree with this view, but he believes that viewing literature only with this view reduces it into a mere tool. The ideology critique and the base superstructure model viewed life as literature in terms of a fixed formula which can be just applied and absolute conclusions can be made. Williams takes a more holistic approach to literature and history. He views literature as a record of a kind of lived culture. You must remember this, very important. He views literature as a kind of a record of lived culture, how cultural forms are actually lived in life by real people. And a creative exploration of the human consciousness. Williams considers literature as a creative exploration of human consciousness. In his view, the exploration of human consciousness in the literary work on the basis of actual lived experience is a much higher and more real kind of history than the logic-based, data-based, information-based history that traditional Marxist critics wrote. He criticized the excessive scientism, like anything can be proved scientifically according to the Marxist. He criticized the economism, that economy is primary. And he criticized the determinism, that everything can be determined in absolute terms. Alright, so he criticized the orthodox Marxist in these terms. Greenblatt continues. And just as Althusserian Marxists objected to historians taking an interest in crime and deviance, education and family or sport, they also resisted scrapping the base superstructure model for separating determinate social phenomena from cultural epiphenomena. It should be understandable now that William criticized the Althusserians for basing their research too much on the ideology critique and the base superstructure formula, which divided society into one phenomena and the other epiphenomena, one primary and the other secondary. All right, so let's continue. Witness, for example, this conversation between Williams and interviewers from the New Left Review who were quizzing him in the late 1970s about passages in his books that are in frontal contradiction with the central tenet of historical materialism. The interview neatly captures a moment when critics such as Williams were simultaneously praised for non reductionist analysis and browbeaten into giving properly historical materialist formulations of their ideas. The interviewers aggressively press for such a formula, asking the same question a dozen times. So you see that the conflict between Marxist historians and the culturalists like Williams is clear in this example. Some interviewers from a Marxist journal called the New Left Review were questioning Williams about some passages he had written in his book that were in clear disagreement with the central Marxist idea of the base superstructure model. This interview is a good example that shows how critics like Williams were at the same time appreciated for their non reductionist ideas. What are non reductionist ideas? Ideas that have been thoroughly discussed in a way that retains and respects their complexity, that do not reduce them to fixed, simplistic concepts. So, people like Williams, critics like Williams, were praised for their non reductionist ideas, but at the same time pressed to give a historical materialist version. Historical materialist version is a slightly modified version of Marxism. So these critics, they want a historical materialist formulation of Williams's ideas. So you see the paradox. Williams was being praised for not being limited to a formula, and simultaneously he was aggressively asked to present his ideas within the formula. The interviewers asked the same question a dozen times. And let's see what the question is. I'm reading from the text. The interviewers say, "It is true that historical materialism does not possess any worked out theory, even for one epoch, let alone trans-epochally, of the exact connections between the economic and political and cultural or ideological orders. But to dwell at exclusive length on this point can be a way of burking and evading the central fact that we can, in a perfectly reasonable and empirically verifiable way, assert that the processes of physical production have till now exerted an ultimate power of constraint over all others. Would you accept that?" In the first sentence, the interviewers agree that the historical materialist formula does not give a verifiable way to know that there's a connection between the factors from the base and the factors from the superstructure. And then, almost in the same breath, they allege that if critics like Williams continue to write on this point, on this lack of a verifiable way to prove that the base controls the superstructure, it would be a straight contradiction to the Marxist idea that there is a perfectly reasonable and empirically verifiable way to be sure that the process of physical production, the processes from the base, exert an ultimate power of constraint over all others. So in a way they say that yes, this can be verified. And the interviewers almost clearly ask Williams to accept that. Look at the way the question is framed. Would you accept that? It almost seems like a rhetorical question. Greenblatt writes, Williams never does wholeheartedly accept it. He points out that the various systems of the social totality are inseparable, that the primacy of economic production may be a mirage of capitalism itself, that culture is just as material and economically significant as any other social activity, and that the processes of physical production are certainly not the ultimate power in the late capitalism. So Greenblatt says Williams does not accept this confused allegation. Williams points out, as we discussed earlier, that the various economic and cultural systems are inseparable. He argues that the belief that the factors from the economic base are primary and control everything else in a society, this is a myth created by the capitalists themselves. Williams argues that it is not only the economic forces that affect the material reality. The cultural forces too are material, and hence his belief in cultural materialism. So he says that cultural forces too are material, are significant, and he maintains that there's no way to verify that the processes of physical production, the systems from the base, exert and ultimate power on the rest of the systems of the society. All right? Greenblatt writes, in other words, his objections tend to come from inside what he called Marxism's alternative tradition of cultural criticism, which included primarily the work of Lucas, Gramsci and Goldman that had taken consciousness as a primary object of analysis. Now, Williams was inspired by a modified, a revised version of Marxism, which was collectively known as Western Marxism, which Greenblatt calls Marxism's alternative tradition. These Western Marxists, who were George Lucas, Antonio Gramsci and Lucien Goldman, moved away from the rigid scientificity and the focus on production systems and considered the human consciousness as the primary object of analysis, which Williams followed when he also took the human consciousness as a primary object of analysis. All right, so let's read further. And yet, the central tenet of historical materialism must still be conceded. The interviewers insist and William only obliquely denies it. So the interviewers press him and Williams denies. The structuralist Althusserianism of his interlocutors appeared to Williams as the ghost of the base superstructure models of Christopher Caldwell and other orthodox Marxists of the 1930s. Perhaps thinking that he had fought these battles before, he seems anxious to change the subject. Christopher Caldwell is a representative of the reductive Marxists of the 1930s, who assumed that they had discovered a great formula, a super formula in the base superstructure model. Louis Althusser, the structuralist Marxist, assumed he had uncovered another super formula by declaring that the superstructural factors of the society are all ideologically motivated by the factors from the base. To Williams, the interviewers and their structuralist Althusserianism appeared as the ghost of Christopher Caldwell and other orthodox Marxists of the 1930s. Now, this is not the first time Williams has faced such confused and somewhat biased questions from his interviewers, so he decides to move on and not respond too much. So he tries to change the subject. He does not, for example, point out that we can hardly claim to have empirically verifiable knowledge of the economy's ultimate power of constraint if we have no understanding of how it constrains. So, Greenblatt complains that Williams doesn't respond adequately to the interviewers. He believes he should have said, how can we know that the economy controls all the other factors if we do not actually know how it controls? How would you really verify that economic factors control everything? There's no verifiable way to conclude that. Greenblatt writes, with Althusser's words resonating in the background, the economy is determinant in the last instance, but the last instance never comes. This exchange seems less a discussion of methods than an attempt to elicit a profession of faith regarding an otherwise inconsequential metaphysical point. Greenblatt maintains that this is quite a similar situation to when Althusser stated that the economy is determinant in the last instance, but the last instance never comes. This means that although the Marxists believed that the economy is the final, ultimate force that controls the rest of the factors, but an evidence, any event or an instance where this could be put to test, where this could be verified, that does not exist and never really comes. Therefore, the interview and its argument, rather than being a healthy discussion of methods of historical analysis, becomes more of a power play, more of an attempt to make Williams admit that he is still a faithful Marxist and that the principles of Marxism are still valid. And it doesn't make a difference if Williams professes his faith in Marxism or not. Everybody knew that Williams was a Marxist right from when he was 16 and he read Marx for the first time. And he remained a Marxist all his life, although he refused to blindly believe in all the rigid principles of vulgar Marxism and modified them so that they become more relevant, more practical, and more connected to actual life. Now, this next paragraph, I believe, can be understood, can be explained in one go. So, I'm going to first read the text and then explain it to you. So, Greenblatt writes, normally the pleasure of reading Williams lay in the absence of such seemingly stale and futile doctrinal controversies. His insistence that theory had an obligation to meet concrete experience or the lived may, on the first hearing, sound naive, but it led him beyond the history of ideology, where many left wing critics were stuck, into a more counter historical inquiry where literary texts half disclose the roads not taken. Williams, however, did not read literature as the direct expression of otherwise forgotten mentalities, but rather as a record of submerged, semi conscious structures. He read literature as the history of what hadn't quite been said. Now, this is the essence, the whole essence of Williams's method of literary analysis and historical analysis, right? So, Greenblatt is trying to tell you that these inconsequential, these useless controversies about dogmas, about rigid orthodox principles, like the one we just read, are generally absent from Williams's work. And this makes his work more focused, fresh, and gives more pleasure to his readers. Now, this paragraph introduces a concept that distinguishes Williams from most of his contemporaries. Williams's focus on exploring the layers of human experience and the layers of consciousness grounded his work in the concrete, actually lived aspect of the human life. So clearly, unlike the mainstream historians who were focused on theoretical exploration of fixed formulas, Williams believed that theory had an obligation to meet the real lived experience. But this doesn't go down easily with his critics, and he was criticized, and Thompson was also criticized for the same view. It sounded naive to the mainstream historians, but Williams, by exploring the deep layers of consciousness, moved beyond the fixed methods of ideology critique, and this led him into a more counter-historical inquiry through literary text. Ideology critics would never use literary text for a historical inquiry. And Williams's point of view took him beyond the ideology critique, where he could rescue the abandoned possibilities, right? Remember, if we read through fixed formulas and theory, we end up like the mainstream historians. Williams based his history on the workings and on the complexities of consciousness, and he explored a counter history of the actual lived experience, and this made his work even more practical and pleasurable to read. And why Williams liked to explore history through literature? Because Greenblatt says that literary texts half disclose the roads not taken. This means, and listen carefully, that in literary text, what we read is not the direct, fixed, formulaic expression of the character's exact feelings. In literary text, what we find is the complication of human expression and experience. All right? According to Williams, there's a gap between whatever we experience intensely and passionately and whatever we say about it. The modern condition in which we live, there are so many ideological limits of language and other powerful structures. It doesn't allow us to express in the exact same terms in which we actually feel. This is most evident in literary texts, which are a record of such submerged, semi-conscious feelings. All right? This is what Williams believes. So, half disclose means that literature doesn't fully reveal, and roads not taken means whatever the character or the author couldn't really say, and what comes to us is just the blockage of that articulation. So therefore, Greenblatt maintains that Williams does not consider literature as a direct expression of forgotten mentalities, but he considers literature as a record of the semi-conscious structures within our consciousness. In Williams' work, there's a concept, a very important concept called the structure of feeling. And this concept is discussed later in this lecture. But to introduce you to it, structures of feelings are the traces of a tension, a blockage, a helplessness which appears in the text when there's a gap between what the character feels and how much of it is he really able to say. What comes on the surface is therefore a record of that blockage, of that submerged semi-conscious structure. These submerged structures are the evidence that half of what was felt is still inside, is still buried deep within the layers of consciousness. This is the reason William considers literature as a history of what hadn't quite been said. All right? Greenblatt further writes, Williams felt the limitations of ideology critique most keenly when it posited a seamless, coherent, and articulable worldview as an adequate frame for historical consciousness. So, Williams felt that the ideology critique was flawed. And what was the flaw? What was the limit of the ideology critique? That they based their historical analysis on a neat and understandable view of the world. The world is not really so smooth and understandable. Actual life is not that unconflicted. All right? It cannot be understood in absolute terms as the ideology critique assumed. By assuming such a simple, straight, understandable world and basing their historical analysis on such a worldview, the ideology critique did not leave any scope for the complexities of the real life, for the incoherence, the conflicts, the inarticulations, that the helplessness that is part of the actual lived experience. Therefore, what did William do? Like other counter historians, he haunted the borderlands where dissonance and incoherence are registered and stressed that modern social experience is replete with cognitive and affective discrepancies which rarely find direct expression. So this is what I said in the previous paragraph too, that in Williams' work we see an importance for those aspects of human life which acknowledge that there's a conflict, there's an incoherence, there's a gap between the experienced and the articulated, which hardly ever finds expression. Now, do you see something familiar here? By working with those aspects of human life which normal mainstream historians had ignored, Williams was, in a way, bringing out marginalized histories. And what happens when someone brings out marginalized histories? They are creating counter history. But in the absence of a direct expression of the lived experience, how did Williams conduct his counter history? Greenblatt answers that. For Williams, though, the discrepancies became legible mainly between the lines of literary works, where hegemony collided with what he called experience. Reading for the not quite said, Williams turned literature itself into a form of counter history. So, since the actual lived experience was not so easily accessible, we just saw that, we just observed that. There's no direct, exact record of how it felt. So what Williams did, he used literary works, he read between the lines. And how do we read between the lines? What is present between the lines? Well, nothing, just some white gap. But between the line actually means that to read what has not directly been said. And ask ourselves why the author or the character wasn't able to say it. What is it that they cannot articulate? Why is there an inability to articulate? This is what we get. These are the questions that we get when we read between the lines. So we ask, are there any hidden power structures in action because of which the author or the character cannot say what they want to say? William answers that between the lines, hegemony collides with experience. What I feel and what pressure the society is putting on me, they both collide between the lines, and comes up is the tension. Imagine that our experience is an actual passionate person stuck inside a suffocating chamber, perhaps of our mind, all right? So our experience is an actual person, actual passionate person, and is stuck inside a suffocating chamber. Now he desperately wants to get out and breathe freely on a white paper forever. But he has to pass through a scary security guard called hegemony. Hegemony here decides that the whole person cannot go on and sit on the white paper. There are some restrictions. If he let the whole person go, then his boss ideology is going to be unhappy. And this is what we call censorship. Experience indulges in a great fight with hegemony. There's a clash between experience and hegemony, and in the struggle, he loses many of his important body parts. Then he drags himself with great effort and reaches half annihilated on the white paper in the form of words. If we read between the lines, of the words on that white paper, we can find the traces of the struggle between experience and hegemony. We find traces of the difficulties the experience had to face in coming out on that white paper. And we also detect that what we see on that white paper is only half the body, is not the whole experience put on the paper easily, clearly, without any restrictions. It had to go through a lot of struggle with hegemony, and what came out is only a tension and blockage and not the whole experience. A counter historian, through the half body on that white paper, tries to trace the other half of the body, tries to bring out the struggle that took place between experience and hegemony. Half the body that was lost in the struggle is whatever was not said. And Williams's attempt at recovering the lost text, the lost experience, the lost meaning, in other words, the lost half body, makes his work the stuff counter histories are made of. I know it's a little bit gross and a lot violent, but I hope it helped and also gave you some adventure in the middle of a monotonous lecture. So let's continue with the text. Normal histories would have to leave out the experiences encountered there, for those elusive and enigmatic episodes could never be explicitly recorded. Experiences, Williams claimed, were clashes between hegemonic articulations and the lived. Now, you shouldn't have a problem in understanding this. Experiences are the clashes of hegemony and experience. Ideology critique alone was powerless to grasp them, but they could be understood as structures of feeling. I've already explained to you what structures of feeling are, so let's see what Williams wants to say about this. The peculiar location of a structure of feeling is the endless comparison that must occur in the process of consciousness between the articulated and the lived. So he says there's a comparison, a continuous comparison between what we feel and what we are able to articulate. For all that is not fully articulated, it comes through, whatever we cannot articulate, it comes through as a disturbance, tension, blockage, emotional trouble. And this is precisely a source of major changes in the relation between the signifier and the signified. Now, the mainstream historians considered that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is a straight one. Whatever a person means, he says. But Williams brings a problematic into it, a complexity into it. And he says that because of the presence of the structures of feeling, because of the presence of a gap between what we live and what we are able to articulate, there's a gap, and the gap creates a tension, a blockage, and what we can access is not the actual experience but the blockage of that experience, and thus the relationship between the event and its explanation, the signified and the signifier, this relationship between them changes here. We have to postulate at least the possibility of comparison in the process. So he believes that there's a gap in the process of living and articulating. All right. Greenblatt writes, but comparison isn't exactly the right word here, for Williams denies that the articulated and the lived are a pair of equal opposite entities. The lived in Williams' work tends to remain unspecified, leaving a descriptive vacuum at the heart of his writing. He frequently relies on a form of quasi-anecdotalism in which experiences are alluded to but are not told. So William uses the word comparison, that there has to be a comparison, but comparison often takes place between two equal and opposite entities. But William says that the lived and the articulated are not equal, are not opposite entities. In fact, in William's work, there's no explanation of what the lived means for him. So there's a vacuum, a lack of explanation in his work on that front. So we see that Williams relies on a quasi-anecdotalism. What is quasi-anecdotalism? The name suggests that in Williams' writing of counter-history, he uses experiences as anecdotes but does not really narrate them. So what does he do? He will tell you that something has happened, but what has happened, he will never narrate it. He will never tell the whole story to you. So he points to certain experiences, but there's no narration of the experiences. In Greenblatt's words, experiences in Williams' work are alluded to but are not told. He alludes to them, there's an allusion, but he never tells what really the experience was. So Greenblatt writes, unspecified things have happened that have resulted in psychic dissonance, which in turn motivates the writing. There are times when there's so high a tension between experience and description that we are forced to examine the descriptions and to seek beyond them for new descriptions, not so much a matter of theory, but as literally a problem of behavior. So Greenblatt continues to explain what quasi-anecdotes are. He says that unspecified things have happened in Williams' writing. There are unspecified things that have happened, which we are calling experiences. These unspecified happenings create an emotional conflict, and that conflict inspires the writing. Williams says that sometimes the gap between the experience and its description is so high that we can take the gap as our subject of research. Examine the gap, examine the description. For Williams, it is not a theoretical issue but a behavioral problem. He means that we examine the inability of the writer, why he couldn't write what he actually experienced. It's a problem of behavior and not a problem of theory. So Greenblatt writes, Williams counts on introspection to provide evidence of a countercurrent to the normal ideologically guided course of thought. And yet, at the same time, the countercurrent cannot be described because it is the opposite of descriptions. So Williams suggests us that we must look into our own consciousness to realize that many a times when we are fed up with the systems of the society and we feel that there are too overwhelming and too many and they exert ultimate power on us and we can do nothing about it, we are disillusioned. There's a countercurrent, a strand of resistance inside us to the normal ideologically guided course of thought. And yet, at the same time, the countercurrent cannot be described because it is the opposite of descriptions, right? So whatever description is ideological. Language that we use, the way that we express ourselves is all ideological. And the countercurrent that we feel inside is resistance against the ideological orders. So how can the countercurrent express itself in description, which is ideological? They are both opposites, right? So a countercurrent that we feel inside, the resistance that we feel inside cannot be described, cannot be put into words, because that will be, in a way, conforming to the ideological powers. This is what Williams tells you. And Greenblatt writes, if the experience and description were to coincide, one would be aware of a decrease in tension, and thus a problem of behavior would be solved. But then the lived, as opposed to the articulated, would have evaporated. The strand of resistance that was inspired, the countercurrent that we felt inside, if we try to put it into words, then the problem of behavior is solved. The person who's feeling is able to articulate what he was feeling in the words of the ideological society. But then the tension evaporates, the essence of the resistance, the countercurrent that was inspired inside our consciousness, its essence evaporates. It almost stops existing. The countercurrent dies if we try to put it into words. And Greenblatt puts it into better words. He says, experience, in other words, seems to be defined by its unavailability to language. The essence of the real passionate experience that we feel, its essence is in its unavailability to language. Its quality of not conforming to the structures of language is what preserves the essence of the experience. Hence, Greenblatt says, and I'm reading, hence it cannot be found in documentary evidence. Only traces or symptoms appear at the superficial level of articulation, and these can only be read as evidence of the clash between ideology and its opposite by generalizing from one's own experience. This lived material cannot have an explicit content. It not only appears at the level of consciousness as language as inchoate disturbance, but also feels like pure trouble. So it means that experience is defined by its unavailability. We read that. Its non surrender to the ideological structures of language. We know that. This is the reason we cannot find authentic experiences in documents. They cannot be recorded into language and they cannot be registered as documents. What we can find on the surface is obviously not the experience itself, but the traces of clash between ideology and its opposite. And what's the opposite of ideology? The resistance, the countercurrent of the experience that we felt. The actual lived experience, therefore, cannot have a content, a form. It's only felt at the level of language as a disturbance, as an abnormal sensation between a sea of normal language. As Greenblatt said in the first section of this essay, there's a change of texture, a trace of blockage, the feeling of a presence of something real. And since it challenges the normal, smooth running course of discourse of language, of other discourses of power, this experience, this resistance and countercurrent, it feels like a rebellious force and hence pure trouble. Experience, I'm reading from the text again. Experience, therefore, cannot speak through the historian like Thomson's voices or can be narrated in even the most enigmatic little stories. And its occulted status might explain why Williams is one counter historian who seldom uses anecdotes. His reference to experiences tend to be vague and formless, as if to emphasize that the touch of the real normally is not felt. Right? His quasi-anecdotes, in contrast with their abstract and halting allusions to muffled uneasiness, seem to preserve the place of experience in its absence. So therefore, we come to know that it's not really possible to narrate the real lived experiences into anecdotal form. They're not easy to pin down and weave into a story. Williams, therefore, himself does not use anecdotes. When he refers to experiences, the reference is not really straight and direct and has no normal form. He does not follow the normal course of narration. His quasi-anecdotes is only an allusion to something happening without really narrating what happened, and are not really concrete stories but an abstract and uncertain pointing to a suppressed uneasiness. Through these vague references and this abstract suppressed uneasiness, the experience is present in its absence. From the uneasiness, we know that there's been an experience, but since the narration is absent, so the experience is retained in its absence. The experience itself is not in the text, but the uneasiness and vague reference makes it come alive more than the narrated anecdotes. Greenblatt further writes, they have, nevertheless, a distinct literary pedigree. These appeals to an experience that cannot be described, derived from a tradition of thought stretching back to English Romanticism and defining the modern as a state of experiential lack and repression. That tradition is well suited to counter history, since both imply that a knowledge of modern times require constant reference to and imagination of all that modernity leaves unregistered in consciousness. So, we should not conclude that since Williams's reference is vague and abstract, he is being arbitrary and doing whatever he is pleased to and not being literary enough. What Williams is doing here is that he is inspired by the Romantic tradition, the English Romantic tradition that described the modern as a state of repression, and also established that to know the modern times, the knowledge of modern times requires constant pointing to and imagination of whatever couldn't make it to the surface due to the restrictions that modernity imposes on an individual. You have to assume that whatever is appearing on the surface of things is only a trace, a residue, that there was something way more complicated, way more intense and passionate than what comes to us in the references to the experience. All right? So, in one sentence, we can sum it up that The modern society has some ideological powers, ideological structures that control us and bind us, and we either don't feel anything intensely, and even if we do feel something intensely, we cannot articulate it in the same terms because the society imposes restrictions on us. And this is what Greenblatt wants to tell us when he says, and I'm reading from the text, placing himself squarely in this tradition, Williams paradoxically writes of experience as that which modern society disallows, not only at the level of ideology but also at the level of experience. We cannot experience the experience, is what Greenblatt is trying to tell you. There are major features in the social structure which are barring intense experiences. They lie very deep within the whole cast of the civilization, which is, for its own deepest reasons, and often while denying that it is doing so, repressing intensely realized experiences of any kind. The same thing that I just said, that the ideological structures prevent us from having intense experiences. One has, therefore, mainly experiences of not experiencing. As in Wordsworth, Arnold, Lawrence and Lewis, intense experience is an occulted thing, a buried life. Now, since Greenblatt has given the 4 names, I have to give you a short hint of why these 4 names have been included to tell you that intense experiences cannot be felt on surface. So we know that Wordsworth writes about a self that is suffering from the harshness of the modern world and finds respite and relief in the lap of nature. We all are clear about that. I also want to tell you that Matthew Arnold also wrote the poem Buried Life, to which Greenblatt is making a reference. In that poem, he writes about a self that turns inward because it feels that the indifferent people of the modern society won't understand his intense emotions. Greenblatt brings D.H. Lawrence, the acclaimed novelist. He showed in his works the dehumanizing effects of the modern civilization, of industrialization on the human psyche. Therefore, these 3 are included. And F.R. Lewis, I must tell you, is the one who influenced Williams into using intense experiences as a source of his writing. So what Greenblatt is trying to do here is he is trying to establish a tradition. He is telling you that Williams is not crazy to complicate subjects in this way. He tells you that it has happened before and it has been established that this is a worthy way of approaching literary texts. So Greenblatt further writes, the trouble that reaches our consciousness is not this interdicted experience, but rather its blockage. We have established that before, that what we experience is the blockage, not the experience itself. The structures of feeling that what Williams analyzes are, for this reason, invariably structures of repression. So what we go through is not an experience actually, it's the repression of the experience by the ideological structures of the society. Elizabeth Gaskell's industrial fiction, for example, embodies rather than displays the author's blocked sympathy for the workers. The structure of her novels is that of sympathy not being realized, of a ghostly would-have-been sympathy troubling the ideological discourse. The study of literature, therefore, allows us to extrapolate the unthought, the unfelt from the tensions in the constraining structures of feeling. You have to read Elizabeth Gaskell's fiction to understand how there's presence of a blocked sympathy, that she really has sympathy, but she cannot really express that sympathy. The feeling of a tension, a gap appears, and this is what Greenblatt talks about. He further writes, this attempt to go beyond ideology critique by exploring the history of what might have been felt and written, and yet was not, verges like much counter-history on counterfactual speculation. So we can now relate that in the first part we heard about counterfactuals when we explore history through the possibility of what could have been. So in the same way, in Williams' analysis, the concept of experience introduces us to the concept of counterfactual, that could have been but could not be because of the ideological structures of the society. So he writes, and in Williams' work, the counterfactual creation that which might have been, but for hegemonic restraints, too often seems a trans-historical notion of natural humanity in retreat from an inhospitable modern world. So, by now, we can at least understand that in Williams' works, it is apparent that it's not really possible to analyze experiences, the real lived experiences, because they don't have a content. So, what appears in his work is a picture of a humanity that is in retreat from an inhospitable modern world. So, it seems that this inward humanity that could have been free, but due to ideological limitations of powerful social structures, it could not be free. It could not come to the surface. Then a humanity appears that is trying to withdraw, trying to save itself from an intimidating modern world. So here we come back to the first paragraph of this section, where Greenblatt told us that in Williams's work we find an attention to those aspects of humanity that were evading modernization, escaping modernization. But there's also a problem. By creating this concept of humanity in retreat from the modern world, Greenblatt continues, and I'm reading from the text. One might therefore protest that this creation is at least as unavailable to historical analysis as Althusser's elusive economic last instance that never arrives. So Williams creates a figure which is as unavailable to be verified and put to critical analysis as Althusser's last instance that never comes. When in the modern condition, the real lived experience is so inaccessible, so buried beneath ideological surfaces, it becomes impossible to analyze the subject, which is the human consciousness. So just like the Marxist theories the interviewers were talking about, Williams' subject becomes as unverifiable and inaccessible as Marx's base superstructure model. Moreover, when Williams complains about our modern lack of a vivid fullness of being, about our privation of life, he seems captivated by the modern literary sensibility and unable to subject its rhetoric of experiential crisis to critical scrutiny. It's no wonder that he frustrated the Althusserians with their antipathy to the humanist subject, for he transcribed the most typical form of literary subjectivity, the alienated self who carries around a deep, inaccessible life, the emergence of which is constantly thwarted into an analytical concept. Now, I know this sounds really ununderstandable, almost like Greek, but I'll simplify it for you, and it's only a repetition of what have been just said in the whole section. So what they seem to be saying is that Williams creates a figure that is unavailable to be verified, right? We've discussed that earlier. So the Althusserians already did not approve of the humanist approach to Marxism, which Williams already had, all right? But Williams created a further problem. Not only he created a humanist subject, he also created the worst one for Althusserians, the most literary one. What he created? The alienated self who carries around a deep, inaccessible life, the emergence of which is constantly thwarted. Now, when I say this line, does it ring a bell with you? Does any figure from literary works come to mind? I'll give you some examples, all right? So, if you've read James Joyce's The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, then you must remember Stephen Dedalus. All right. If you have read Albert Camus' The Stranger, you must remember Meursault. Meursault, whose opening lines in the novels were, "Mother died yesterday or today, I don't know." A character that inaccessible and that deprived of emotion. How would you put such characters to historical analysis? And the best of all, if you can imagine the narrator from the poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Imagine him saying, in the room the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. And when he says, Do I dare disturb the universe? And do I dare disturb the universe? And he keeps repeating that. And in waiting for Godot, when nothing happens and no one is able to articulate what they're feeling, and sometimes they're not even feeling anything. So, can we put all these characters to historical scrutiny? Although personally I feel that I can, but I'm not authorized to say that right now because Greenblatt seems to be making an opposite point here. So I should shut up and continue that he maintains that the Althusserians blamed Williams for creating a character, for creating a figure of humanity that cannot be put into historical analysis. So they believe that this is all crazy to think that an individual devoid of experience, devoid of feeling, devoid of articulation can be a subject of historical analysis. All right. So now let's quickly move to the text. The Althusserians pointed out that the rhetoric of a fugitive true self was part of the ideological apparatus through which subjects are interpellated. Althusserians maintain that this figure of an inaccessible self was a part of the ideological system, and that the people who read such figures in literary texts get interpellated. When people like us read those literary texts and read about these alienated heroes that are aloof, disillusioned, kind of attractive, so people consciously or subconsciously begin to idealize these figures, and thus these literary figures, according to Althusserians, become ideological apparatuses in which the readers are interpellated by the desire to follow them. Now, Greenblatt says Foucauldians might similarly have expostulated that the mighty flood of language about the inarticulable and inaccessible creates a desirable, half-submerged object for the disciplines of the human sciences to pursue. So, Foucauldians are a term that refers to the scholars following Foucault's philosophical ideas. They agree with Althusserian's point of view and say that talking too much about such a submerged, inarticulable self creates a desirable object which the humanists can study. Alright, change of para. Greenblatt says Williams' insouciance on these points is undeniable. He did not register the force of such criticisms because they seemed to him to emanate from dogmatic, deterministic, and unicausal analytic schemes which he was predisposed to reject. So Greenblatt agrees that we cannot deny that Williams has not acknowledged these points that the Althusserians and Foucauldians have made, but it may also be because Williams thinks that these allegations are based on dogmas, which are fixed principles, and these allegations are deterministic. What is deterministic? Eager to draw an absolute conclusion in a definite form. So these arguments he felt were dogmatic, deterministic, and unicausal. What is unicausal? Considering that one cause can have only one effect. So he thought that these arguments are dogmatic, deterministic, and unicausal. So he doesn't really care about these allegations. All right. So Greenblatt writes, the conflict that developed on the British left between culturalists like Thomson and Williams and post-structuralist Althusserians certainly carried an excess of political baggage. Although it often concentrated on the prevailing theoretical issues of subjectivity and agency, underneath one always heard the rumblings of a much older and more practically consequential debate about whether common people were capable of knowing their own situations or instead needed a scientific leadership, a vanguard party to enlighten them. So the conflict that existed between the culturalists like Williams and Thomson's and post-structuralist Althusserians was not only about the issues of agency and subjectivity. Their views not only differed on these fronts, they also had a political conflict. So if I want to tell you simply, the political conflict is that the Althusserians and most Marxists who were rigid in their perceptions, they believed that people are incapable of knowing their situation and obviously deciding their political course of action. Whereas Williams thought that these people are totally capable of deciding their political action, their situation. So, behind these arguments about agency and subjectivity is the political conflict of whether people are able to understand their situation, or they are so blinded by ideology and ideological powers that they cannot really see what's happening to them and how they are being interpolated and how they are being used to advance power, that they need a vanguard party, a leadership to show them the way to political freedom. Williams considered these views of Althusserians as elitist because they thought that the people are masses who need a leading party. And in Williams' famous words, there are no masses, there are only ways of looking at people as masses. So obviously, their political ideology was different, and that added to their conflict, right? Let's move ahead with the text. Rightly or wrongly, Thompson and Williams heard the familiar strains of Communist Party elitism in structuralism and were, as a result, deaf to its more powerful arguments. So, since they had closed their approach to the structuralists, they were not in agreement with the structuralist ideas. These culturalists were closed to even their more powerful ideas, which could have been used, but they did not use them because they did not really approve of their approach. Exacerbating this political antipathy, the suspicion that Althusserianism was Stalinism redux was the threat of a return to monolithic history without side shadows, alternatives, or countercurrents. Their political conflict was further fueled by the culturalist suspicion that Althusserianism was like Stalinism. What was Stalinism? It referred to the ideas and practices of the Soviet Union leader Joseph Stalin, who was a kind of a dictator, who was a rigid Marxist and believed that the masses need a leadership. All right? And he even would resort to violence if he wanted the people to follow his ideas. So, the culturalists believed that structuralist Althusserianism was a sort of a mini version of Stalinism. And if we follow their approach to history, they can make us end up with a monolithic, unilinear, grand history with no scope for negotiation, alternative views, or resistance or countercurrents. So simply speaking, culturalists like counter-historians, they wanted a history that allowed scope for marginalized aspects of human history. They wanted a possibility for alternative points of view. They wanted a scope for resistance and disagreement. But the Althusserians, the culturalists suspected, may lead history to the exact opposite direction, where history's grand narrative leaves no scope for those who have been silenced and erased. All right. So here we come finally to the last section of this essay. Greenblatt writes, "For the critique of the subject seemed a reduction of the complexity of human history. Subjects who were merely epiphenomena of specific interpolations of dominant ideological structures could never have alternate historical realities to rescue. They would not even possess organs for sensing the dissonance so important to Williams' idea of experience. In short, they would seem to be devoid of all those countervailing cultural, psychological, and political traits that make the stuff of counter history." So here Greenblatt is making a reference to the subject that Williams had created. Williams had created a subject that was not available for analysis because it was inaccessible. All right. But what did the Althusserians provide? What kind of subject did they give us? They gave us a subject who's just a byproduct, an epiphenomenon of the dominant power structure. This subject would not have any alternative realities to rescue. He wouldn't have any organs for sensing disagreement within himself. He even wouldn't have any consciousness in the first place. So he wouldn't feel the tension and the blockage, the gap that forms the basis of Williams's subject and forms the basis of his counter history. This subject, the Althusserian subject, would be without any cultural, psychological, political features that are required to be a subject of counter history. So in a way, Greenblatt seems to be concluding that having the Williams sense of subject, which has no accessible experience, which has no accessible surface, is better than having an Althusserian subject that will not even have any sensibility or organs to sense the dissonance within themselves. All right, so on this note, we conclude this section. I would, at the end, like to summarize whatever we have said in this video so that you can recapitulate whatever was discussed. Number one, in Williams' work, all the streams of counter history meet. What are the streams? An attention to the forces resisting modernization, number one. Number two, exploring the cul-de-sacs where unrealized possibilities were stranded. Number three, he studied the relationship between culture and society. And number four, he had deep interest in observing how concepts like society and culture are formed. All right, this was the first thing that we noticed. Second, Williams insisted that literature is not just an ideological tool like the Althusserians believed, and it is not only a byproduct of the Bayes superstructure formula. Third, Williams maintained that the rigid following of the Bayes superstructure model can never give a glimpse of the complexity of concepts like culture and consciousness, and can never register the importance of the real lived experience in the making of history. All right, the next point that we discussed was Williams introduces us to the concept of structure of feeling, which says that whatever we feel deeply, we are unable to articulate. There's a gap between whatever we really experience and whatever we are able to articulate. Wherever this gap is, there's a feeling of blockage, a sense of tension, a trouble. Literary texts cannot narrate what a person actually intensely feels. Literary texts can only half disclose the experience that is felt, and they can just make us aware of the blockage of this narration. So, in Williams' work, there's only a pointing to the experience and not its narration. This is called quasi-anecdotalism, and this is how experience becomes presence in its absence. And the last major point that we discussed was that behind these arguments between the Althusserians and the culturalists like Williams and Thompson, there's a political conflict about whether common people can lead themselves in the direction of democratic freedom. The Althusserians believe that the masses need a vanguard party to lead them, but Williams believes, and other culturalists believe, that there's no masses, only ways of looking at people as masses. Greenblatt concludes that the structuralist ways look at humans as mere subjects with no sensibilities and even organs to feel and show alternative realities, feel and show resistance, and therefore the question of counter history through structuralist methods does not arise. All right, so I hope this video helped you. I know it's a longer video, but anytime I feel like I will skip this part. I felt like I was just betraying you guys, so it got a little longer. I'll try to make the next one shorter, so please excuse me for that. And I hope this helped. Thank you so much, and like and subscribe and share this with your friends if you think this was worth it. Thanks so much. Have a great day.